If you're into your disaster movies, then you may have come across some of these before. A group of scientists are surveying a remote jungle when they discover evidence of an enormous prehistoric eruption, much larger than anything humanity has ever witnessed. Racing back to the lab, they discover that it isn't ancient history repeating itself, but rather the future. The very same volcano is rumbling once again, and it could blow at any moment. If it does, it will blast ash into the atmosphere, triggering earthquakes, tsunamis, and global climate chaos. And unlike in the movie where the world is given a 24-hour head start, this time there will be no warning at all. Volcanic eruptions are a fact of life on Earth. There are volcanoes all over our planet, and we know that eventually they will erupt again. So it makes sense that stories about giant hidden volcanoes threatening to wipe out all life on Earth are so popular. But how realistic are they? Is it really possible that somewhere beneath our feet lies a slumbering giant just waiting to blow? And could it really throw our entire planet into chaos? Well, it turns out that it is indeed possible that somewhere beneath our feet lies a slumbering giant just waiting to blow. They're called supervolcanoes, and according to various sources, there are between 1–2 dozen dotted around the world. Thankfully, while they have certainly erupted in the past, none are currently showing signs of imminent activity, and even if one did erupt, we now have the technology and the knowledge to warn everyone to get out of the way. But still, it would be nice to know what these ancient giants are, how they differ from more typical volcanoes, and what might happen if one of them did erupt again. Now, most volcanoes are pretty small fry when compared to supervolcano. After all, Mount Vesuvius, which destroyed the Roman city of Pompeii, only had an explosive index of 5. That's a scale from 1 to 8, created by the U.S. Volcanic Explosivity Index, which estimates the relative violence of volcanic eruptions based on the height of the eruption column, volume of material erupted, and other factors. For comparison, a supervolcanic eruption has an explosivity index of 8. Now, we don't have many examples of supervolcanic eruptions in recorded human history. In fact, there's only been 3 in the last 10,000 years that meet the criteria. The first was at Lake Toba, in Indonesia, around 74,000 years ago, which ejected 2,800 cubic kilometers of ash and pumice. The second was at Mount Mazama, in what is today southern Oregon, around 7,700 years ago, which ejected 1,500 cubic kilometers of ash and pumice and created the now Crater Lake. And the third was at Mount Yellowstone, in what is today Yellowstone National Park in the U.S., around 630,000 years ago, which ejected 9,650 cubic kilometers of ash and pumice. These super-eruptions were all caused by magma chambers, which formed beneath the Earth's surface due to tectonic plate movement. You see, the Earth's outer layer is made up of lots of giant cracked plates, which are constantly shifting and moving. These are known as tectonic plates, and new magma can well up inside the gaps between them, and in some cases it can force its way up through the cracks themselves. When this happens, it forms igneous rock, and if it reaches the Earth's surface it forms mountains, and in some cases volcanoes. When a magma chamber gets big enough, it can become unstable and erupt violently. If the magma chamber is particularly large, this can trigger a supereruption, hence supervolcano. While all 3 of these eruptions happened in the recent past on the geological timescale, they are not the largest volcanic events in Earth's history. We can find evidence of much larger eruptions dating back hundreds of millions of years. Some scientists estimate that 3 billion years ago there was a massive eruption in what is today the Kapval crater in South Africa. It may have ejected as much as 2 million cubic kilometers of ash and pumice. To put that into context, that's roughly the equivalent of 800,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools full of ash and pumice. But while these ancient super-eruptions are impressive in their scale, they didn't have the same impact as you might expect. For example, the Younger Dryas impact event, which some believe to be caused by a comet shower hitting Earth around 12,900 years ago, may have actually been caused by a series of large volcanic eruptions. And it's thought that the Toba eruption only had a relatively minor effect on human evolution, despite the fact it happened during the Stone Age. The reason why? Well, It depends on the definition of supervolcano. Some scientists argue that a supervolcano isn't defined by its size, but rather by its impact. For example, they argue that a smaller eruption with a significant global impact should also be considered a supervolcanic eruption. By this definition, the 1815 eruption of Mount Toba in Indonesia, which killed over 90,000 people and triggered a year without a summer, was a super-eruption. Others go even further, arguing that any eruption that significantly affects global climate should be considered super. This would include the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens in the US, which, while not as big as the others, had a significant cooling effect on the global climate for several years. So how likely is it that a supervolcano will erupt again and destroy the world? Well, there are currently no signs of any supervolcanoes gearing up for action, thankfully. However, there are a few that scientists are keeping an eye on just in case. One of these is Mount Vesuvius, home to the aforementioned Pompeii. Now, most people know it for its destruction of Pompeii, but it's actually two volcanoes sharing one caldera or crater. The other is Mount Somma. Now, Mount Somma hasn't erupted since the Middle Ages, but scientists monitor it closely because it's so close to heavily populated areas. Another is Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. It had a relatively small eruption in 1500, but the 1991 eruption was far more significant, ejecting 700 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. It was the second largest eruption of the 20th century, and while it didn't cause global chaos, it did cause significant regional devastation, including thousands of deaths and billions of dollars worth of damage. A third is Mount Unzen in Japan, which features in a popular Japanese horror film. It had a fairly small eruption in 2001, but scientists are worried it may have another larger eruption soon. Another is Mount Ibu in Indonesia, which has had several large eruptions in the last few decades. And another is Mount Ibu in Indonesia, which has had several large eruptions in the last few decades. The good news is that none of these are currently showing signs of imminent large eruptions, although it is possible that one of them could erupt in the coming years. And while such an event would undoubtedly cause local devastation, it's highly unlikely that it would cause global devastation. Of course, we can never say never, and we do live in an unpredictable world. And if we did get hit by a large volcanic eruption, it could cause significant problems, including earthquakes, tsunamis, and global climate change. However, unlike in the intro, we would hopefully have at least some warning. Remember the 1980 Mount Street Helens eruption mentioned earlier? Well, scientists had been monitoring the buildup of pressure beneath the volcano, and they even predicted the date of the eruption within 2 days. With modern technology, it is possible to predict when a volcano will erupt, although obviously it's impossible to say exactly when. So it's always best to heed the advice of local officials in areas known for volcanic activity. As for those slumbering giants mentioned at the start, well, there are a few places that feature both supervolcanoes and uncontacted tribes. But even if word did somehow reach the outside world that a supervolcano was about to erupt, it's unlikely that anyone could convince these groups to leave their homes. So, while it is possible that these ancient giants could wake up again, it's thankfully extremely unlikely. And even if one did erupt, it's unlikely that it would cause global chaos. But that won't stop Hollywood from trying. So, thanks for watching. If you liked this video, check out the playlist for other explainer videos. All the best, and see you next time.